Okay, so thank you, Laine, for joining me. You work at the Good Food Institute. You work in finance there. So I was wondering if you could just open up by telling me a little bit about yourself. How long have you been at the GFI and what you do there?
Sure. And thank you so much for having me. I'm technically not in finance. I'm sitting in for Sharon Murray, who is our head of finance there, but I'm going to do the best I can. I am the Innovation and Entrepreneurship Manager for the Good Food Institute. So I work very closely with all types of investors and certainly closely with Sharon. But I did want to make that one correction because she's awfully good at what she does. I've been at GFI for about 2.5 years, and I'm also an entrepreneur in residence for the Georgetown University's entrepreneurship program. So I've been in the startup world for quite a while, and then prior to that, I was a founder myself, and so I've been working with startups for about 20 years. And working with startups, of course, involves a lot of working with investors and helping mobilize capital. So just to give you a little bit of background on the Good Food Institute, we're a nonprofit think tank and international network of organizations. We're building a more sustainable food system by transforming meat production. We have about a little over 200 team members right now across 6 economies that include Asia Pacific, Israel, India, Brazil, Europe, and the US. And in each of these geographies, we cover policy, sci-tech, and corporate engagement. We're primarily funded through philanthropist and private grant-making foundations, which helps us very much because we can remain agnostic and we're not tied to any one corporation. We publish a vast amount of open access research, and we also have one-to-one advisory services. So we're, I hope, providing a service that is quite unique in the alt protein universe.
Yeah, so you say that you've worked with a couple of startups before. What were these startups, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, sure. They were in the pet food sector, actually, which sounds like it might not be related, but it's actually quite related because animals consume a great deal of domestic animals consume a great deal of the conventional meat production across the globe. And one of the startups that I was with was actually a vertically integrated company that focused on regenerative, organic, and sustainable farming. So lots of education there. And what happened was I kind of going up the chain and realizing that I wasn't having enough impact. So even with regenerative agriculture and organic farming and sustainable farming, I still felt like I was producing a product versus going and helping to shift a food system. So GFI was the logical choice for where to go to actually make a global impact.
Okay, you might be interested. I don't know whether you've heard the news that yesterday cultivated meat was approved in the EU for sale in pet food.
Fantastic news.
It is great news. I mean, it's I mean, I'm not sure whether it's indicative of the EU's intentions to approve more widely cultivated meat, but it's certainly good for pet food.
You bring up an interesting point because time will tell. We'll have to see what happens. But while it is an area of great impact, it also may or may not affect consumer perception. So I'm very interested to see where that tracks in the coming months and years.
Yes. And also with the GFI, you were talking about funding. I've always been quite surprised by just how much money they seem to have at the GFI. So there are some very deep pockets there. I've always imagined. I mean, are you able to sort of talk about the kind of donors and the philanthropists?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that our donors, first of all, yes, we have incredibly generous donors, and they're motivated by different things. So some are interested in mitigating climate change, some are trying to achieve global food security, others might be interested in human health, and some might be motivated by animal welfare. And so because I think the work we do impacts so much of the planetary problems that we have, that affect so many of them, we have a broad array of donors who might come to us for different reasons. And yes, they have been consistently incredibly generous. We also have a really caring development team, and I think that they are just absolutely amazing. The work they do, the way they build relationships, it's just a masterclass. So I'm really grateful to each and every person, no matter what they're giving, each foundation, each person, it all adds up, and we need it because that's the only way that we exist.
Yeah. So are there any kind of major donors? I mean, do you have the likes of Jeff Bezos on your list? But if you did, would you even be allowed to?
I'm not, unfortunately. We
No.
keep our donors anonymous, at least when we're talking publicly, and I think that that's out of respect for their choices and what they decide to do. So I'll, with great respect, skip that one.
That's all right. That's all right. I've spoken to a few people working with the GFI. I spoke to Radhika in India, and I've spoken Chris Kraus in Japan, and a couple of other people. So I have been very interested in the work of GFI. It seems to have quite a few functions, and one of those functions now is to encourage investment into the alternative space. So are you seeing investment increasing at the moment or decreasing?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question because it's complex. So I want to first start by saying this industry is nascent. It is still brand new. And what happened was a few years ago, I think a lot of people latched onto it with a probably bit of irrational exuberance for how far it had advanced at that point. So we saw really crazy valuations. We saw investors kind of just pouring into the space, and there was so much deal flow, and there was fear of missing out, and all of that comes with sort of those moments for a sector. And I think that what's happened now has been affected greatly by the macroeconomic situation, of course. And I think if you look just sort of globally, venture funding has declined about 42% compared to the same time frame in 2022. So our industry has been impacted as well. Food tech in general has been impacted. I will say that year to date we've raised about 682 million for the sector. That's a meaningful decline from last year, which was 2.9 billion. So when you hear it put that way, it sounds like, oh my gosh, the sky is falling. But that's not what's happening. We're having a correction of a sector that was probably overblown before for how far it had come. And now I think we're righting the ship. This is good news to us. We, of course, want to see much more money in the sector in the coming years. But I like to see sort of a rationalization of a sector because it goes along with the Gartner hype curve. And we've seen this many, many times in different industries. I think electric vehicles are an interesting comparison. In 2011, there was a declaration that it was the year of the electric vehicle. Well, we know that wasn't true, but flash forward, 12 years, and you have Norway, 80% of new car sales are electric vehicles. We're expecting that same kind of curve to happen for alt proteins.
Okay, so you're not expecting there to be a bit of a sort of a burst bubble, like with the like with the dot-com boom and the kind of technology boom.
No, this is definitely not a blip or a bubble. And the reason it's not is that we have to shift the food system. It's just not sustainable. If we continued down this path, we would need many, many more planets than we have. And that's just not going to happen. So we're going to have to find the answers. And there is a very healthy, thriving ecosystem out there working on all kinds of aspects of alt proteins up and down the value chain. And the hype around the burst bubble, I think, is just that. It's hype. It makes for good headlines. But we are just seeing a normal growth of an industry, and especially during times of geopolitical distress and macroeconomic decline, I think we're holding up pretty well. In fact, our deal sizes in our sector were a little larger quarter over quarter this year than in food tech as a whole.
Okay, I mean, there are some, there are probably some companies that are overpriced, wouldn't you say, that have had a bit too much money kind of pumped into them and are not really producing. I'm not going to name any.
Yeah, I think just like with any new sector, again, you see a lot of companies rush in and only a few sort of stand out. So one of the things that happened, which I think was unfortunate, is that there was a priority placed on rushing to the shelves. So for CPG companies, it was kind of who can get the product out fastest. And when that happens, sometimes taste goes by the wayside. So we acknowledge that sort of plant-based food in the past 5 years or so, the innovation around it may not have come up to where it needed to be with taste parity, and that matters. So some investors, I think, jumped on the bandwagon a little soon, and now what we're seeing is a big shift where investors are saying, hold on a minute, I need to do a lot of due diligence. I want to really de-risk this investment. And maybe they're asking for a techno-economic analysis, or maybe they're asking for a life cycle assessment, but they're definitely not just saying, I want to get into this space because everybody else is there. They're asking a lot more questions now.
Yeah, and I suppose these plant-based companies are asking themselves a lot more questions as well, because they were kind of producing product that wasn't as good as the real thing and cost 2 or 3 times more than the real thing. So so they've had to kind of realign themselves with the consumer expectations.
Yeah, I think that we probably needed to focus a little more on consumer expectations. And so fortunately, we're still way early in the game, and we can do that. And I by no means think that these kinds of hiccups are unusual for new industries. I think they're completely to be expected. And I think we've been pretty quick in realizing that we need to do a better job of getting better products to the shelf. And there are some really good products out there. I don't want to malign the entire sector, plant-based sector, but I think it's pretty much common knowledge that some of them just didn't reach taste parity.
Right. Okay. So where have you noticed, Laine, that most of the money right now is going? If it's not going on the plant-based sector, where do you think most of the money is going? Which area of the industry and which countries?
Yeah, so this year, as of mid-October, we had about 312 million invested in fermentation globally, about 201 million invested in plant-based globally, and about 169 in cultivated. And I want to provide a caveat about that, which is we're led by a lot of large investments in 1 or 2 companies. So the numbers can skew very quickly. We have a handful of growth stage investment, and those deals account for the majority of the investments in any given quarter. So just to draw a point, put a fine point on it, in 2022, 3% of alternative protein deals accounted for half of the total investment dollars in APs. And those were in the big deals. So I think when you look at it that way, you kind of can understand how these numbers, while reflective and meaningful, can get skewed very quickly.
Can you explain that to me? Because I didn't quite understand what you were saying then. So in 2022, can you explain that to me again, please?
So 3% of the deals in 2022 accounting for half of the investment. So in other words, you have really big deals accounting for a big chunk of the investment. And then a lot of the smaller deals make up the rest.
Okay.
And so it takes maybe 1 quarter, you have a deal that's just monstrous, that's a couple $100 million. Well, that's going to, when you're looking at numbers like, okay, we had cultivated 169 million year to date. If this had been a few years ago and Upside was getting their investment, that number would have ballooned.
Yes. Okay. And so this money is coming through GFI, is it? Or is it just, are you kind of acting as a broker? No, not really.
No. We are strictly a think tank. And so we're not only is it not coming through us, but we're not making direct connections to we're not saying, hey, X investor, this is Y startup, we think you all should meet. We can't do that because of US regulations around the type of organization we are. So what we do, though, is we create resources that investors and startups can use when they're looking at available and attractive deals. So we have an investor database, a fundraising database, and we just started a funds database. And so with these resources, they can see who's in the space, see who's looking, find out who's interested in maybe raising at that time. And then we also have other resources. Like we have a mentor program that includes some very incredibly generous people with deep industry expertise. A lot of them are investors, and so they will provide guidance for startups or investors as needed. So we try to create as many resources as possible to expedite and mobilize capital into the sector, but we certainly aren't handling any of those deals.
Right. Okay. Because I got invited to the fund, the GFI fund. So I suppose in order to join that, because I didn't go through the process, but I suppose you would sort of say how much you want to invest and what area you might want to invest in. Is that?
Yeah, if you're an investor, you would join the directory by saying, this is my area of interest. And then there's a lot more that you would provide about your fund. And then people, it would either be for startups to come in, but with the new fund directory, we can actually have funds come in and look at limited partners who are interested in the sector. So we've got quite a few resources that I think, I do think we do quite a bit to move capital around the world, but we just never get involved directly.
Okay, just going back to what you were saying earlier, you said that last year it seemed like the majority of the money invested was going into precision fermentation.
For this year.
This year.
So far.
Oh, that's this year. Okay. And the least amount is going into cultivated meat. So I suppose people are slightly cautious about its success. Maybe.
Well, I don't know that it reflects so much the caution as it reflects the maturity of each of the platforms. So plant-based has obviously been around forever, a really, really, really long time, decades, and has been a focus for investors for a long time. Fermentation is newer, but it has more traction than cultivated, and cultivated is the newest. So I think when you look back to the last decade, we're really seeing that reflected in the numbers in terms of how much money is going into each one of the platforms. And just for some comparison purposes, so in 2022, fermentation came in at 842 million versus 312 to date this year. Cultivated was at 883 versus 169.
Wow.
This goes back to what we were talking about in terms of a few big deals can send the numbers different ways. So keeping that in mind, yes, it has definitely been a different kind of year for us, but I don't think that the cultivated numbers accurately reflect the interest in cultivated meat. With that said, we are seeing a lot of investors being a little bit more careful, and cultivated is earlier, so it's harder to de-risk it.
And I suppose precision has you have a kind of nearer return on your investment perhaps with precision than you would on cultivated meat, or at least that's the perception.
I think that's probably true. It depends on what part of fermentation you're dealing with, because there's biomass, of course, and that's definitely a quicker commercialization process. We see that with a lot of companies already. And then you have a situation where if you're going into precision fermentation, it depends. If you're trying to produce an ingredient, then I think, yes, that could be fairly, if you're doing a precision fermentation created fat and you were going to use that in a plant-based burger or something, yeah, that could be commercialized fairly quickly.
Yeah.
And cultivated, we're already seeing it on a tiny percentage of plates in the US. But I think what's happening in cultivated is we're reaching some potential tipping points. So the growth media, for example, that's traditionally been the most expensive part of cultivated meat. So that has been a challenge. And we're seeing a lot of innovation in that area, bringing costs down.
Yeah.
And so I think that over the next 5 years, for example, a lot of companies are predicting that they'll be able to bring those costs down to parity for like $1 or less than $1 a liter, which is where we need to be. And if that happens, then I think the path to commercialization is much faster. I should bring up, however, that we have a very big obstacle coming our way with regards to commercialization, and that is capacity. We have to have the ability to get these technologies commercialized, and yet it's extremely expensive. and it requires specialized equipment in some cases. And we just don't have the capacity we need yet. So GFI is working hard on that problem, as are many other companies around the world and governments. And I think we can get there, but there are many, many questions. And of course, there it gets complicated because are we going to see more greenfield or brownfield? Can companies go from being science-based to also running their own facility? Those are two very different types of businesses to be in. So I think that that's a really interesting space to watch.
Yes.
And I don't, it's one that probably is going to move beyond venture capital. So that's where we're going to have to see governments get really involved.
Okay. So when you talk about capacity, you're talking about kind of building the bioreactors and
building the tanks, the cultivators, making sure that the equipment is correct for what's happening. We can't retrofit everything.
Yeah.
A lot of it will have to be built. And we have very innovative companies working on that problem as well. So we're seeing all of these cultivated meat advancements happen quickly. And I think that we're going to get there faster than we had planned, but we're by no means in an advanced stage of cultivated meat. I mean, this is years before everybody's going to be able to walk into their local grocery store and pick it up.
Right. Okay. Well, that depends who you ask, doesn't it? I mean, I've been told that we should see it in the supermarkets in 3 years by some scientists, but I suppose the problem is I'm talking to people in the industry who are perhaps.
Well, I very intentionally said years and didn't put a number on it because we don't know. I mean, if these advancements continue and if they increase, then we could see a very much expedited path to market. But there are just certain hurdles that are going to have to be overcome, and we're at the beginning of overcoming them. And regulatory is a big one. We've got to have a lot of governments approve cultivated meat. We have to make sure that we have cost parity, that we have taste parity, which is much easier to achieve in cultivated meat, of course. And we're going to have the investment, because some of these facilities are, I mean, I think the estimate is 300 to 400 million sometimes for one of these facilities. And so that's a lot of money. That's not VC capital. VC capital isn't patient enough for cultivated meat commercialization, quite honestly, in most cases. So we might be able to approach it through blended finance or project finance, definitely through government intervention here. I think that's going to be the key. I think governments really need to fund not just the research, but also the infrastructure.
And do you think there's a good chance of that? I suppose it depends on whether Donald Trump gets into power or not, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think there is a good chance, but right now we're seeing the countries leading the way are Singapore, Denmark, Canada, Australia, the Netherlands, UK, Israel. Unfortunately, you didn't hear me say the US there.
No.
We're working on that.
No.
But the US leads the way in investments, but the government support is not as well developed in the US in this sector, unfortunately. But we hope that will change. We're definitely joined by many people around the US working on that problem. I think there's a very good chance that this will become a priority for many, many governments in the future because of all the problems it solves. So not only do we feel like there's a huge issue around food security, which will be the motive for some countries, but we're also just looking at the issues of deforestation and climate change. And I think that the sector could support, I think it's 9.8 million jobs. So that's economic value coming to different regions. And then I think also the number is 1.1 trillion in economic value if the sector comes to maturation. However, that's going to require about 10 million per year from governments globally to get there. Okay. So the benefits—
10 million or 10 billion? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. 10 billion.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
I said, yeah. So I think that countries are going to see the value in shifting the food system, but we've got a little ways to go.
Yes, for sure. So have you have you seen any other trends in regard to what people are investing in? I mean, it seems clear that they're investing in precision fermentation. Have you seen any trends in regard to sort of countries that? I mean, you've talked that that the kind of government.
We see a lot of investment from private investment. You're talking about, right?
Yeah,
we see from North America is predominant by a large margin, and then Europe, APAC, Australia, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America comes in at the last. So I think in terms of investment trends, it's not so much the geography as it is what we're seeing people interested in. So there's a lot more, I think, interest in, for instance, novel proteins. So in the plant-based sector, for instance, we're seeing interest in cowpeas and mung beans and chickpeas, and we're seeing a lot more investors interested in, say, ingredients like I mentioned earlier, alternative fat, which could be either produced through cultivation or through fermentation. We're seeing more interest in that, and part of the reason is that that's so much faster to take to market. So rather than investing in a whole cut steak, for example, which may be a little bit farther away, investors are getting more excited about kind of helping improve flavor profiles, taste profiles. I think capacity is another one that, not necessarily the huge capacity, but just capacity in general, is something that's pretty attractive right now. And I would say hybrids are of interest a little bit at the moment, and blends. And so we're seeing some opportunities there. Now, on the larger corporate stage, as you know, all of the large food and bev companies or all the largest meat companies are investing in alt proteins in some way or another. So I think we're going to see a lot more M&A activity and liquidity events over the next couple of years. And again, I think that's going to be great for the industry, because that helps, companies can all of a sudden get to better resource pools. They can kind of share in the technology. So I think these are good things that are coming.
So when you say that the big meat companies are investing, you're talking about the likes of kind of Cargill and JBS, right, and I mean, are they investing a substantial amount, or are they just sort of making moves to look like they're interested, or is it kind of?
I mean, they're investing substantial amounts. I mean, JBS invested $100 million in a cultivated acquisition. So I think, of course, there are different plays that different companies make, but yes, in general, this is something they're very serious about. You see a lot more talk about protein in general versus like being insistent on conventional meat production. That's been really reassuring, because I think we need the very large players in the sector in order to get to where we need to get.
Yes. Do you think, I know this is slightly off topic, but do you think there's going to be much kickback from the meat lobby groups in the US? I mean, obviously the kind of big meat companies don't care where their meat comes from as long as they have meat to sell, but the kind of meat agriculture, is that going to be a problem?
I'm not the right person to talk about that, because our policy team would have a lot more to say about it. I think we've certainly seen some kickback, but that's not really where our focus is, because honestly, because this is a mandate, it just has to happen. We are going to find a way to make it work. And the lobbies are very powerful in the US, but we're talking about a global food problem. And so, as I've already mentioned, lots of countries are involved in this. So am I concerned that the US meat lobby is going to prevent this from happening? No, definitely not.
No, but they could slow it down, I suppose, couldn't they?
I think that it could, but as we've seen many, many times before in the energy sector, for example, there's just so much you can do when a technology makes sense and has a tremendous amount of benefits for the planet before you succeed. So again, I'm not concerned. I think we will probably run into some friction at some point for sure.
Yeah. You mentioned in your list of countries which you think are investing money and kind of putting energy into this. You said the UK. I mean, I'm aware that the UK has invested around 12 million last year, which I mean is a very small amount, really, isn't it, for a whole country?
It's very small. It was 19.9 million last year, and that was through research grants.
It was,
but yes,
then, I think, wasn't it?
And just to put the numbers in perspective, I think last year Singapore invested 123 million, Denmark almost 100 million, and then Israel 18 million. So, you know, the numbers, it's a broad swath of numbers.
Yeah, and Israel is obviously doing very well with their
yes.
with their industry as well, aren't they?
Yes, they are, and it's I just take an aside to say that ecosystem is absolutely unbelievable. They are so committed to what they're doing, and despite everything they're going through right now, these founders are out there working hard for the sector, and GFI Israel is working hard as well. It's just amazing to see their tenacity.
Yes, yes. Have you heard of the Horizon project in Europe?
No, I have not.
It's a project which is kind of funding all efforts to try and reach net zero, and they've got a budget of around sort of 96 billion. And so there is, and so they are using a proportion of that for cultivated meat. And
oh yeah, I did hear about the funding that was coming to cultivated meat. I did not know that it was Horizon specifically, so my apologies.
Yeah. Oh, that's all right. And so Horizon are investing in kind of multiple companies, kind of research companies, and that sort of thing, which obviously makes the kind of 12 or 19 million from the UK look a bit silly.
Well, none of it is silly. It's all needed, but yeah, we do expect it to grow quite a bit in the next few years.
Yes. Okay. Well, so are you confident that you'll be able to persuade that the industry will be able to persuade the government to put enough money in? Then, just sort of finally, do you think that it is going to happen?
That is the billion-dollar question. I just don't know, and we hope so. We are seeing some very favorable signals from governments around the world, and with our government, I will say there are quite a few alternative protein champions within our government. The Department of Energy Loan Program Office has recently indicated interest in alt proteins and has worked closely with us. We just had a webinar actually that you can access online where they talk about what's available through their program. We are working through some of the obstacles, and for example, the language that exists in that loan program office, it's not necessarily tailored to alt proteins. So companies are kind of having to try to fit into the requirements. But the fact that all of these companies help to mitigate emissions and climate change risk is a big mover and a big reason that the government is interested in them. So I think as that becomes more and more evident, we will see more and more pathways for the government to fund.
Okay. And just finally, before I let you go, Laine, I mean, have you got any predictions for next year? Because we are getting close to the end of the year. Do you think it's going to kind of go in the same direction, or do you think there might be a kind of turnaround for investment in this space?
I think there's definitely going to be a turnaround for investment in the space. Now, whether it happens next year is no one knows. But we are seeing some signals. We're seeing some activity that feels like things are moving in the right direction. I just talked to a specialist investor last week who was signaling greater optimism and greater deal flow than they had previously in the year and even in 22. So I think that we're seeing a little bit of stabilization. I think people are getting used to the fact that interest rates are just probably going to remain high in the US and they're moving forward. but it's definitely not going to be an overnight kind of turnaround. But I think we are, I feel like from the investors I've talked to, the sentiment is generally that we're on the other side of the roughest patch.
Okay.
I hope that's true. We definitely are seeing liquidity events that will, I think, fuel a lot of activity in the space and maybe harken a new day for us.
Well, that is a very optimistic way to end it. So we are hopefully either at the kind of bottom of the trough, or we are past the bottom of the trough, and we'll be on our way up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate the chance to speak with you, and I do want to end on a very optimistic note, because we are busy in this ecosystem. There are so many companies out there doing world-changing research and changing our future generations for the better. I don't think we should get too caught up in any media hype at the moment. I think just slow and steady wins the race.
Yes, well, I like to think that kind of science never goes backwards, so it will have to out anyway. So, you know, I'm optimistic. And thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you.
It's been